I think there are three real big liabilities for small business operators. Those dealings, so property dealings, number one. Number two, their employees. That's a massive liability. And then number three, their customers. And just because you're really good at what you do, it doesn't mean you don't have to pay attention to all the other things. If I could give any advice to new business operators starting off is build that good team, build that good network. And when I say team, I don't necessarily mean you need to hire people, but have that good and strong network, have those mentors, have a good lawyer, have a really good accountant. Bounce your ideas off. Ask for advice. There's no such thing as a dumb question when you're risking your own money, your own reputation, your own future on these things. I know if you've got something urgent on, I'll call you back and I'll answer your questions and we'll go through it. But find a good lawyer, find a good accountant, ask them the questions, get advice early, mitigate your risks early so that you don't have to deal with the problems that might arise later on because you decided I can do this on my own.
Good day everyone, and thank you for joining me in another podcast on the Mortgage Chat. Today, I have a very good friend of mine who's known me since I was a little kid in the name of Simon Kang, who's a partner in Longton Legal. Thanks for joining me today, Simon.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
So Simon, can you tell us a bit about yourself and, what do you do as a profession?
So I'm a solicitor. I work for Longton Legal, which is a mid-sized law firm in Australia. We've got offices throughout New South Wales. We've got 3 offices in Sydney, 1 in Parramatta, 1 in Cabramatta. Quite significant operations in Melbourne as well, but only in the CBD at this stage. And we're opening up operations in Brisbane. We operate across most practice areas that most people would need in their life, but I primarily work in commercial law. Most of my clients are either small to medium-sized businesses, small business operators, all the way down to sole traders. And I guess some of my larger clients would be asset-wise worth, in the billions, turnover-wise, hundreds of millions. Staff-wise, probably largest would be probably around 400 to 500 employees. Wow. So not huge. Mm-hmm. They still, I think, fall within the SME kind of captured definition, but quite broad and quite a broader range of industries as well. So really interesting in terms of the work that we do in commercial law. A lot of commercial law touches on dealings with property as well, or dealings with assets. And obviously our job is to be there in the good times during growths and acquisitions, occasionally mergers, all of the good transactional things, but also to be there in the bad times, which unfortunately there are quite a few bad times, a lot of risk exposures whenever you're operating a business, and those risk exposures might be in property dealings, for example, dealings with third-party companies, but also internal dealings as well in terms of structures with employees and contractors and compliance issues with government. So pretty interesting and broad range of work that we do.
Yeah, sure. So Simon, I'll put you into it because you're a specialist in commercial property dealings.
Look, I wouldn't say specialist, but we do a lot of dealing. We do a lot of work in the commercial property space. Mm-hmm. In the acquisition side, not so much, because, even acquiring a commercial property, that pretty much falls within the property and kind of conveyancing scheme. But in the management of commercial properties, because owning commercial properties itself is a form of business. Yep. So we act for a lot of landowners in and around the CBD area, for example, and their business is leasing our properties to other businesses. So office spaces, industrial spaces, or retail spaces throughout the Sydney metro area.
So can you tell me what's the difference between a commercial lease and a residential lease? Because you handle a lot of commercial leases.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't understand why is there a need for a solicitor or lawyer to get involved with a commercial lease.
There's no actual legal obligation for you to have a solicitor when you enter into a commercial or a retail lease. But for a lot of small and medium-sized business owners, a commercial lease or a retail lease is probably the biggest contract they ever sign. So having eyes across it in terms of what your legal risk exposures are, as well as completely understanding what your obligations are in a commercial or retail lease is actually really important, because when and if things go wrong, they can go horribly wrong in terms of significant disruptions to a business for a small business operator. So it's really important to understand what you should be doing, what you should not be doing, what other risk exposures are there in relation to commercial leases and retail leases. And you'll find that there's a interplay with, your obligations as a director or an operator of a business, but also in your personal dealings as well, because most, I guess, commercial or retail leases or any kind of contract you enter into when you're obliged to do something, these days, a lot of the companies who are providing that contract to you require you to give a personal guarantee as well, just to ensure that you do comply with your obligations. And I've seen so many instances of directors signing away guarantees, having no idea what they're really signing into. And then when things do go bad, they can go pretty bad, significantly bad. Worst case scenario would be, any assets within your personal name can be, essentially put at risk if you don't comply with your obligations under these agreements and you've signed a personal guarantee.
So when is it? So you touched a bit where a personal guarantee has to be placed with a lease, has to be provided with a lease. When is the situation where I'm, as a director of a company, do not need to provide personal guarantees?
It all depends on how good of a negotiator you are,
right?
Really, because these are all commercial negotiations. Let's take a step back. If you're going to be really smart about doing this, and unless you've entered into many, retail or commercial leases in the past, I would recommend that you engage a solicitor before you even sign the heads of agreement. Now, a heads of agreement is essentially a document they'll ask you to sign, which forms the basis or the primary terms of what you've negotiated. How much you're going to pay in rent, how much or the method in which the annual increase of the rent will be on the anniversary of signing that particular lease, how long the lease will be for, any kind of incentives that come with signing into the lease, if there is going to be an option period as well. All of these things generally are housed within the heads of agreement in terms of these are the agreed terms. Once that's signed, it then goes off to the lawyers who draft up the leases, and the lawyers for both sides will negotiate the terms of the lease, the other terms, the legal terms of the lease. But really, if you don't have a lot of experience in commercial or retail lease, if let's say you're starting a restaurant for the first time or any kind of business for the first time, an office space, a retail space, whatever it might be, if you've never done it before, your best bet is to go to a commercial lawyer prior. Say, look, I found a place, I really like it, I'm negotiating terms now, I need your advice before I sign this heads of agreement. The reason for that is those lawyers will know currently in terms of what the market is allowing for these kind of incentives, what the current CPI increases look like, fixed percentage increases, what they currently look like. So you might be able to get a better deal by going to a lawyer, and it'll save you significantly in terms of the commercial sensibility of that deal. And then engaging with them to the point, well, if they've been there through that early process of negotiations, it'll be a lot easier for them to then negotiate the terms of the lease as well, because they'll be fully aware of what it is that you're trying to do.
You'll have seen a lot of different terms and conditions yourself, looking at all these different leases yourself, right?
Yeah, I have. And I guess the benefit of Longton Legal is that we work for some pretty big landlords. So we do a lot of work on the landlord side. Right, where we draft these leases, we negotiate with the tenants that are incoming and their solicitors. But having said that, we also do quite a lot of work on the tenant side as well. So it's really good to kind of view these transactions from both sides of the equation, because it gives you a better understanding of, I guess, the areas in which you can push and the areas which, you might not be able to so much.
So you know how far to push the guys.
Correct, yeah.
Right, and you advise your client how far to...
Correct, yeah. Ultimately, you don't get what you don't ask for, right? But you need to know when to ask or what it is that you should be asking for. What we find is that particularly with this younger generation coming in, like this, whatever the generation is called now, they are quite savvy. But that sometimes works against them because they think they're smarter than they actually are. So we've seen instances where they go and enter into leases, again, finding information on ChatGPT or online, and then realizing that, they've actually negotiated something horribly. The terms aren't great. Things haven't gone well. And then they're coming to us after the fact. Whereas if they'd come to us early, we could have avoided a lot of these problems right from the get-go. It would have saved them a significant amount of money. So it comes back to that point again. You don't technically need a lawyer to enter into a commercial lease, right? However, it is very prudent to do so. And it is not only prudent to do so, it is the industry norm. So if you are dealing with a commercial agent, for example, they ask you on the application form, solicitor's details. Yep. So the assumption is that you've got a lawyer. Yep. Now, if you don't, they will literally be clapping their hands. Great. Yep. Like, we will get our complete way with this person. So it's really important that you do that. And entering into a commercial lease, you're talking about a couple of $1,000s. It's not a huge amount of money, right? But in terms of the savings and the knowledge that you get along the way, it's invaluable. I've got clients who 10 commercial leases a year as a tenant, and they know the documents inside out. But even then, they still use solicitors just in case, right? So what I find is the more experienced guys still rely heavily on lawyers, to assist them throughout this process. So it's really important that people who are starting out as well kind of heed that advice and do the same thing.
Now, you touched a bit on a lot of your dealings are with vendors.
Yes.
Slowly going into looking after tenants.
Always done both.
Yep. Okay. So let's talk about as a vendor, what are my rights, as example, if something falls apart with the tenant. So let's say, for example, we had a 5-year lease in place. Yeah. 2 years down the track, because of COVID, for example, business has gone down, sales gone down, the current tenants are able to afford the rent. So as an owner, what sort of rights do I have?
Well, okay. So as the landlord, the lease is merely a contract. All right. So it's an agreement between two parties. It's a contract. Okay. So a lease is a contract, and a contract is essentially a negotiation tool between parties, right? What you've promised me in that contract is ultimately what I've got a right to, right? If I'm complying with my obligations under the contract, which is to provide you this space, quiet enjoyment, leave you alone, let you do your thing, run your business from there, then my expectation is that you live up to your end of the bargain, which is you pay the rent and you pay when it's due. You might be obligated to pay outgoings as well. There might be other obligations you've got that are non-monetary as well. But if you stop paying rent, and you'll find in a lot of commercial and retail leases that if you don't pay the rent when it's due, then you're given a further additional period, let's say maybe 7 or 14 days in which to come good and pay the money that you owe. If you don't pay it then most leases would then incorporate a penalty interest on monies that you owe, on the arrears. If for a period of time you're still not paying it and it's clear to the landlord that you're not going to pay it, then other enforcement measures might have to apply. So they might foreseeably lock you out of the premises. And if you're running a retail business, for example, the moment you're locked out of the premises, you can't operate your business. Your business comes to a standstill. We can then chase after you for whatever the arrears are. And chase after you can take many forms in terms of the enforcement process. But let's say it comes to a point where there is no ability or the communication between the parties is completely broken down. Well, then ultimately the final resource is taking you to court to get that judgment or order against you. How this plays out can vary depending on the circumstances. But if you had given a personal guarantee, so let's say, okay, let's go through two different scenarios. No personal guarantee.
Yes.
And you signed up on the lease as director of a company. Then we'll chase the company, we'll bring proceedings against the company, we'll probably get a judgment or an order. There's very little you can do to defend your position in a situation like that in court. Here's the lease, we gave you the premises, you didn't pay rent. What's your defense? There is no defense to
So
it.
where's the bank guarantee come in place? Because normally when you lease out a commercial property, there's a bank guarantee that comes in place normally around 3 months.
Okay, so there's a security required.
Yep.
And that security can be in the form of a bank guarantee or a security deposit sometimes, depending on the situation. Bank guarantees are pretty common now. How big the bank guarantee is, again, depends on how good of a negotiator you are, but it also will depend on such things as what's the length of the lease. Generally, the longer the lease, the bigger the bank guarantee.
Right. So we can dip into the bank guarantee if a tenant does not pay the rent.
Again, that'll depend on the provisions of the lease, whatever the lease says. But as a rule of thumb, if you haven't paid and you're meant to pay, and you haven't paid even after a reminder notice is sent to you, realistically, most landlords would have the right at that stage to draw on the bank guarantee. Most leases also wouldn't obligate the landlord to get your consent. They could just call on the bank guarantee, go to the bank and say, I need to call on this bank guarantee. The bank guarantee is an original document. I think it's really still quite old school. the way it works, but you get an original piece of paper and you've got to take that down to the bank and say, look, I've got this.
Yep.
That's my name. I'm the favoree. I'd like to draw X amount of dollars on this. And the moment they've done that and they've taken that money and you're up to date, well, then you're in breach of the lease in terms of the fact that you've given a bank guarantee which is less than you're supposed to because they've already drawn on it. So then they can hit you up again and say, you need to provide us a top up of this bank guarantee or a new bank guarantee, right? So those obligations will continue. But again, there are so many things that can go wrong with a commercial lease or a retail lease if you don't comply. It's really important that you get proper legal advice because you might even enter into a small lease, 20 grand a year for a small booth somewhere. You might be entering into $1 million lease, right? Regardless, the obligations still apply. So it's really important to get that advice leading up.
So the logistics of a commercial lease and a residential lease is very different. Because with a residential lease, I can break the lease and I can pay a small penalty. But with commercial lease, it's actually not that easy at all.
No, entirely different, black and white. We don't deal with residential leases often. Actually, I don't think I've ever really dealt with a residential lease because it's not the kind of thing, it's not that complex. And you've got the Residential Tenancies Act, which provides protections for tenants.
Correct.
It's quite plainly drafted, so the guidelines are quite clear and easy to understand. And most residential tenancy disputes tend to be kind of resolved through the property managers and agents through NCAT. So the jurisdictional powers are with NCAT to deal with that. So lawyers don't really, I mean, I'm sure there are lawyers that do deal with it, but we don't really deal with residential tenancy issues. But you don't have an overarching systems otherwise. In commercial dealings, it's really buyer beware, and you're obligated to take your own measures, okay, to mitigate your own risks. Having said that, there are some, protections in place for retail leases. So the Retail Leases Act applies for retail tenancies, and there are further obligations for landlords when it comes to retail tenancies than there are with other commercial tenancies. And whether something is a retail lease or a commercial lease is actually determined by the Retail Leases Act. So there's a schedule there that kind of lists out, well, if you're operating this type of business, then it's a retail lease. The lease itself won't really say, there's no special cover page that says this is a commercial lease or this is a retail lease. It's a reliance on law or the legislation to make that determination. But common sense also applies as well.
What sort of problems they could potentially come to?
Law is such an interesting profession because we get hit with different fact scenarios every day, and every day, you know, I've stopped getting surprised. I used to get surprised. I don't get surprised anymore with some of the things I've heard. But, you know, you see like what example can I give you? Look, I won't give you a specific example, but I'll give you something. Okay, I'll give you a general example.
Give me general.
Young guy, really enthusiastic, very good at what he does.
Like me?
Like you. Bit younger and better looking than you, but very good at what he does. Started a business bar/restaurant, doing really well. Bit loose, probably because of that young kind of carefree attitude. Fell into arrears, just really wasn't paying attention to the things that he was meant to pay attention to. Got to a stage where the landlord would say, look, that's just enough.
Enough as in arrears.
Yeah. And we got to court, basically emptied him out, made him bankrupt, personal assets are gone. Can't travel overseas without the consent of the trustee in bankruptcy for 3 years. Credit ratings completely shot. It can have a significant impact on your life. And it's just because of that blasé attitude, and just because you're really good at what you do, and a lot of these guys they're really good at what they do. It doesn't mean you don't have to pay attention to all the other things. So you have to pay attention to all these other things. If I could give any advice to new business operators starting off, is build that good team, build that good network. And when I say team, I don't necessarily mean you need to hire people, but have that good and strong network, have those mentors, have a good lawyer, have a really good accountant, bounce your ideas off, ask for advice. There's no such thing as a dumb question when you're risking your own money, your own reputation, your own future on these things. Ask. That's what they're there for. They've seen it before. So build that good team. Don't be afraid to ask the questions. Learn from your mistakes, because you will invariably make mistakes. Everyone does. And grow from there, but pay attention, especially to notices that you receive in writing. So if you receive anything in writing, pay particular attention to those things. Just don't be blasé about things that are what you consider to be peripheral. to the business and to your operation, because those peripheral things can really have a significant impact, whether positive or negative, on what it is that you do.
100%. Let's dig in a bit more deeper in relation to what you just said, in delinquency. The last 12 months, we've seen a lot of changes. The economy, rate, inflation, people working from home.
Yeah.
Right. Obviously, that would have had a big effect on some commercial premises.
Yeah.
Also, delinquencies have you seen more of in relation to like a retail space or an office or a factory? Like, can you comment a bit?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I work primarily in and around the CBD area. I've got clients everywhere.
Yep.
Stretching all the way through to Camden, Penrith area, Emu Plains, and everywhere in between. But the majority of my clients operate in the Sydney CBD area. If you look at the Sydney CBD area at the moment, depending on where you work, particularly, retail has suffered to a certain extent, starting to come back.
As in, what do you mean by coming back? As in,
we're starting to see the occupancy rates increase.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Starting to see a lot more, I guess, fit out work or building work taking place within premises that have been empty or that were empty, particularly through the COVID period. Office spaces, I think, is still somewhat tenuous. There's probably a bit of movement there because of this adoption of this new hybrid working model. Businesses are rethinking what it is they need in terms of a physical space. I don't think they're giving them up exclusively. People still want to have that home base, right? That you can have, whether it's in the CBD or wherever else you operate from. So I'm not really ready to kind of give a general overview of offices just yet, because I think that's kind of developing as we speak.
Yeah.
Industrial spaces have just skyrocketed. So getting into industrial, or the right industrial space anyway, has been quite competitive. And I'm seeing that industrial sites aren't remaining empty for too long. They're turning over pretty quickly. And again, that makes sense to me because the whole 3PL, the whole, web-based businesses, they don't really need a storefront, like as in the traditional retail glass frontage. They just need a warehouse, a space where they can pick, pack. And I've seen a definite growth in that area. So pricing in that industrial space has become quite competitive as well. So the prices aren't stagnating, so to speak, of leases within those particular areas. So that's doing well. Commercial leasing, retail leasing, it is a big focus point. Probably one of the bigger liabilities any business operator will ever have. I think there are three real big liabilities for small business operators. Those dealings, so property dealings, number one. Number two, their employees. That's a massive liability.
Yep.
And then number three, their customers.
So as a consumer that wants to lease out an office, for example, what are the things I can personally look at or questions I can ask the agent that could be a deal breaker before coming to you?
Look, I wouldn't say deal break, because finding the right place to operate your business from is going to be a factor of a lot of things, right? You might find the perfect place, and it's just a matter of asking the right questions to know what it is you're getting yourself into. And the first thing is going to be, obviously, how much you're going to pay in rent. That's the big question mark, number one. Number two, find out if you have to pay outgoings and what your contribution of those outgoings will be. Outgoings generally mean any other kind of costs that the landlord incurs for having that space, land tax, council rates, occasionally insurances as well. Outgoings generally won't include your use utilities, but they may include water. But so, gas, electricity, internet, phone, you'll pay that separately. Negotiate the term of the lease, and the term meaning how long the lease is going to be for. And this is quite important. Also negotiate whether you get an option. And an option is, let's say you've got a 5-year lease with a 5-year option. The option is your option as the tenant to say to the landlord within the option exercise period, I'd like to renew the lease for an additional 5 years.
Right. So it's my rights.
It's your right. As long as you exercise the option in the manner it is meant to be exercised as defined in the lease. So if the lease says you need to do A, B, C in this period to exercise the option, and you do A, B, C in that specified period, then the landlord can't say no.
So 5 by 5, so typically you're going to operate in that office or commercial facility for 10 years. That seems very long. I mean, maybe for Macca's KFC.
Is it standard? I mean, what's standard, right?
Yeah.
A 3 by 3 by 3, a 2 by 2 by 2, a 5 by 5 by 5, a 10 by 10.
Yep.
Like, what's standard? It all depends on you and your circumstances. But I'll tell you why it's important. Let's say you have the next big up and coming beverage idea and you start this site and it kicks off and it goes viral and there's lines outside the door for days and the business is doing really well. Let's say as part of your exit strategy, you want to sell that business and you've got a great offer. Well, if you want to sell that business, you've only got a year left on your lease. The value of your business is quite nominal because the landlord might turn around and say, nope, not extending the lease. But if you've got an option for an additional 5 years, well, then the value is increased of your business. So you need to consider these things early on. Some people start businesses for the purpose of running that business, it becoming their career for an extended period of time. Some people start businesses with exit strategies already in mind. I want to build this up over 3 years and then I want to put it to market to see what I can get for it. Well, what is your plan? What is your strategy? Some people say, look, I'm not sure about this idea. Let me try it out and see what I can get. And if it does well, then maybe I'll, consider renegotiating in terms of the lease. Well, if that's the case, it might be better for you to ask for a shorter term lease, pay a bit more on the rent so you reduce your risk and your liabilities, and then ask for bigger options. So maybe a 2+5 or a 2+4 or a 2+3, whatever it might be. It all depends on, but again, these are discussions you can have with your lawyer early on so they can really understand what you're intending to do and then try to negotiate the best outcome for you in terms of what your intentions are.
What's the biggest lease term you've came across?
The longest?
The longest, sorry. So what's the longest lease term that you've ever came across?
10 plus 10.
10 plus 10?
Yeah.
How about shortest? Let me take that one step back, right? 10 by 10, what sort of business was that?
It was a service business in an industrial area, but 5+5s are pretty common. Like a 5-year lease is not unusual. That's pretty standard. The shortest I've ever done is probably 12 months.
12 months. Residential leases, okay, more than likely you'll have a property manager that looks after the property, right? Does commercial really need a property manager? Or do you see most of these landlords managing the properties themselves, especially that's a strata title?
Yeah, okay, good question.
Because I was saying that because commercial property managers charges a lot, charging up to about 10% management fee per month in comparison to let's call it a residential, which charges anywhere between 5 and 6% plus GST in New South Wales.
Sure. I think having that third degree of separation is important. Unless you're actually operating your commercial property as your own business, and your intention is to apply your full-time hours to the operation of that business, if a commercial property is purchased by you as an investment, as a side thing, and you've got other things going on, then obviously I think it's important that you have the resources and tools to be able to manage that property properly, right? Because it's a significant investment. Commercial properties aren't cheap. So having a commercial or a commercial property manager in place is probably a smart thing. In most of my dealings, I would say at least 95% of my dealings, there is a property manager for commercial properties. Very rarely do I find people managing commercial properties on their own. I've come across it only a handful of times, and each time it's an absolute disaster. They don't truly understand being an owner and being successful in something doesn't mean you know everything and everything else. You need to understand your limitations. The other problem with that is you need a certain level of detachment to be professional. When you're managing something that you own yourself, and the reason I say it was a disaster is because they take everything personally. They can't be impartial about their dealings. And I think having that extra layer of protection and management is probably of ultimately greater benefit. The fees you pay in management fees would be offset against the time you save because ultimately your time is also valuable. It could be used for other things. And owner-operators, I think, become a little bit too invested when things don't necessarily go well and they waste a lot of time unnecessarily.
So give us a bit of a tip. Now you're doing a lot of leases, purchases, etc. What's been hot? Industrial sites, definitely. The occupancy rates are amazing. They are yielding, from what I can see, quite good returns. The management of an industrial site is quite low, quite easy. There's not a lot to it. A lot of industrial sites are built within complexes and you can buy a unit and so there's a building management committee and there's structures in place to help you manage the property and
your, I guess, ownership of part of that property. The other good thing about industrial leases is general overhead and maintenance is low, and the terms of the leases are generally quite long. And as an investor, that's important, having that kind of that surety over an extended period of time.
The resale value of that is also a lot better with a longer lease still in place.
Well, I mean, it has various values to you, right? Value propositions. So having an extended lease, a lot of people buy industrial sites purely for the purpose of investment. So if there is a tenant on title, then that helps. But it also helps with financing as well, right? So if you want to borrow money from the bank and you can evidence to the bank that you've got their significantly long tenured leases in place that has great value to you in terms of, the way the banks view you as a borrower. So that's beneficial as well.
Yeah,
so
put that lease stock, right? If someone that doesn't have the financials to substantiate the borrowing capacity, then yes, you'll go something that's a lease stock. In a long-term lease would actually help that significantly.
So yeah, industrial spaces, but realistically, the bigger industrial spaces are largely kind of operated by the bigger property management companies. A lot of superannuation funds own industrial sites. Oh, really? So a lot of the bigger sites are owned and operated by super funds, and they establish or set up management companies to manage those properties. Mm-hmm. We see more of the mum and dad investors purchasing kind of the smaller units in, the 2 to, I guess, 500 square meter type space. For industrial, it's not. For industrial, that's, still relatively quite small. Some of the leases I deal with are 10, 14,000 square meters. So $1.5 million a year. So they're what we consider to be the bigger industrial spaces. Your 2 to 500 square meter spaces are quite small, but manageable. And again, I think doing quite well and moving. There's always the exception. There's always going to be some areas that aren't doing well. Yep. But industrial is largely driven also by location. That's really important. Like, how close is it to arterial main roads? How close is it to the ports? How close is it to here? How close is it to there? So that's really important. The operation of a business is an exciting time, right? Yeah. It's a culmination of someone's dreams, aspirations, whatever. It is exciting, and it's very easy to get ahead of yourself.
Correct, 100%.
Yep. Very important. Find a good lawyer, find a good accountant, and a broker. Find a good finance person, get a mentor, bounce off your ideas. Don't be scared to ask questions. It doesn't make you look silly or stupid or inexperienced. Mm-hmm. Everyone was inexperienced at some stage. With experience will come instinct. With instinct, you'll start making better decisions. But earn your way there and talk to the people so that you don't make the mistakes people before you've made. That's the benefit of talking to a lawyer. They've seen the mistakes other people have made. They can see the road that you're going down, and they can help you to make sure that you don't make those same mistakes. My phone goes off constantly, all the time, and I've got a really broad range of clients. I've got people who've just started out, and I've got people who've been in business for 40 years. Mm-hmm. A lot of times they'll ask me the same questions. There's no shame in that. Find a good lawyer, find a good accountant, ask the questions. Mm-hmm. Yeah, save yourself the heartache and the headache, because when things go wrong, it has an impact on you, and you can carry that impact home. Save yourself that trouble. Mm-hmm.
You came across a lot of these situations before, scenarios, right? So you know how to deal with it and what advice to give.
That's right. And all it takes is a phone call. Exactly. And if your lawyer does, because good lawyers are busy, like, don't get me wrong, but we assess it as well. Yep. And I know if you've got something urgent on, I'll call you back and I'll answer your questions and we'll go through it. But find a good lawyer, find a good accountant, ask them the questions, talk, get advice early, mitigate your risks early so that you don't have to deal with the problems that might arise later on because you decided I can do this on my own.
Just save a few $1,000s, right? Cost them a lot more down the track.
Yeah. Look, in terms of the saving of not only money, but your time and also the headache, but also the disruptions it may cause to whatever business you're operating will be significant. Talk to a lawyer early on and they'll give you an indication, not only of, your dealings in commercial properties, but when you want to hire people, if you've got business partners, you want to enter into a shareholders agreement, like all of these things need to be considered early on. And that will save you a lot of time and money later, a lot of money. And it won't cost you that much early on, but it's an investment into the future of your business.
Yeah. Simon, thanks for your time today. It's very insightful what you've given us in the commercial world. Where can we find you, Simon, if our clients want to engage in your services?
So if anyone wants to talk to me or anyone in my team in commercial and property law, just go to www.longtonlegal.com.au. You'll see my profile on our website, and my email address and phone number are there. But we'll have all of our solicitors, all of our team members there, and all of them have their contact details available on the website. So whether it's a commercial lawyer you need, maybe you've already got a dispute on foot and you need someone in litigation, we've got a very strong commercial litigation team. Those, team members will be there as well. You could be doing anything else. I mean, like I said, Longton Legal essentially practices in all legal practice areas that most people require. Family law, criminal law, commercial property, migration, personal injury compensation, civil litigation. So we have all of the areas pretty much covered. So anything you need, just go to our website, find the appropriate person. If you want to talk to someone in commercial, tell them Tony sent you and you contact me, then I'll give you a free 15-minute consult. Talk to me. Look, I got into law because I like helping people, but I used to, as you know, Tony used to own restaurants and gyms as well. So I used to hire commercial lawyers, and I used to get really fed up with the ones that I was dealing with, and maybe I just had really bad luck. But I thought,
just like the bankers and brokers you dealt with, what you dealt with me.
Correct. That's the first time you throw me off. But yeah, I was really fed up with the lawyers that I was dealing with. I thought, you know what? Surely there's got to be better out there. So I got into law myself, and I did so because I knew what it was like to be the client. I was the one signing the leases. I was the one signing the guarantees. I was the one employing people. And I understand the perspective of my clients because I've been there. I was them for over a decade, as you know. And so I have a very different, I guess, way of approaching assisting my commercial clients in the legal space.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. So Simon, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
And guys, we'll see you next time.